It was a very complicated accident, believe me. And I'm going to try and do my best to make it as understandable as possible. So with that, what I'd like to do is actually start with the geology of the Macondo Prospect in a nutshell. So Macondo is in the Gulf of Mexico, and this is the outline of the Gulf of Mexico basin in red. It's the Jurassic shelf edge, and that's a structural limit. So it includes the US Gulf of Mexico and Mexico. It is the third largest petroleum province in the world after the Middle East and West Siberia. It has about 250 billion barrels of discovered oil equivalent barrels. The US Gulf of Mexico, the areas offshore of Texas and Louisiana are available for leasing by the US federal government. And this area is broken into actually three structural provinces. One is the Gulf of Mexico shelf, which is this kind of gentle slope that goes out to about 600 feet of water depth. And then you get into what's called the Deepwater, which goes from the edge of the shelf here, sorry, this pointer's not very exact, out to about 10,000 feet of water depth in the middle of the abyssal plain here. And the Deepwater is broken into this structured area, which is caused by salt deformation, which I talked about in my previous talk, and then the unstructured abyssal plain. And it's in this structured salt province that is where the prolific deepwater oil fields are. And Macondo was located in this structured part of the salt basin in about 5,000 feet of water. The Macondo structure is called a turtle structure. And the way turtle structures are formed is you start off with a layer of salt. In this part of the Gulf of Mexico, that salt was at least 1,000 feet thick. And salt, then on top of the salt is deposited various kinds of sediments. And salt is incompressible, such that when the density of the overlying sediments at the top of the salt reaches the same density as the salt starts to flow and tries to regain equilibrium. And when it does that, it starts to form these pillows. And once you have these pillows formed, sediment then gets deposited in the lows between the pillows, which is this kind of green layer here. As more sediment gets dumped on top of it, the salt gets destabilized again and forms diapirs. It keeps wanting to go up in the section to reach its equivalent density. And when the diapirs form, the edges of this stuff collapse, and you get a structure, a turtle or dome-shaped structure. And this is the case for Macondo in 3 dimensions. So that if you look at a map, and this is where the equivalent of where the Macondo reservoir, oil reservoir, is on this structure, this cartoon. So if you look at a map, this is a typical turtle structure, or it's a 4-way dip closed structure. And it's not Macondo, I couldn't get a map of that, but it's a typical turtle structure. And the Macondo well was drilled in an equivalent place of about here, so very near the crest of the structure. Okay. So this was the Transocean Deepwater Horizon rig. It was built to operate in water depths of up to 10,000 feet. It was not anchored to the seabed. Instead, it was dynamically positioned by thrusters, 6 thrusters in the corners of the drill ship that maintained location by communicating with beacons that were on the seabed. It's a semi-submersible drilling rig, which means that when it was towed to location, and then when it got there, there were pontoons under the water here. So the pontoons and part of these legs are filled with seawater to partly submerge the rig and keep it very, very stable. For scale, this rig has had 2 lifeboats. This orange pod is a lifeboat, and each of those have the capacity to hold 73 people. So it is an enormous structure, 367 feet long. This is a blow-up of the map where Macondo was located. So this is Texas coastline, Louisiana coastline. This is the Gulf of Mexico shelf, as I mentioned. So this red line is a 600-foot water depth contour. All the red blobs in here are oil field or gas fields. All the green blobs are oil fields, and these other symbols are drilling locations. And then you get into the deep water. This is where Macondo was in 5,000 feet of water. 5,000 feet of water is not particularly deep for deep water drilling. You can see that there are lots of locations around there, and these yellow blobs are all deep water fields. So you can see a lot of wells have been drilled in deeper water than this. And the well itself was not particularly deep. Including the water, it was about 18,000, a little over 18,000 feet deep. There have been wells drilled in the Gulf of Mexico routinely to 30 and 40,000 feet. So on Wednesday, April 21st, 2010, I was 6 days into my new role as Deepwater Gulf of Mexico New Wells Delivery Manager. And I was at home making breakfast for myself and my 3 kids, and I heard this clip on the radio. I was listening to the radio, and it said that a rig in the Gulf of Mexico was on fire. That's all it said. But of course, I was like, oh my God, you know, I hope everybody's okay. I hope it's not that serious. You know, maybe it's all those fields I showed you on the shelf, all those gas fields, most of those have a structure on them, but they're unmanned platforms. And so I thought, well, you know, maybe one of those had it there, and many of them are very, very old. I thought, well, maybe it's one of those, and it's going to be okay. So I finished breakfast, gotten the kids off, went into work, walked into the coffee bar on the exploration floor, and saw my friend Pinky Vincent, and he was looking very pale. And he said, Cynthia, have you heard? And I said, no. Heard what? And he said, there's been a blowout on the Deepwater Horizon. Now, blowout's a really, really serious term. And, you know, so it kind of took me aback, and I said, well, Pinky, how do you know it's a blowout? And he didn't say anything. He just showed me a picture like this. The picture he showed me was actually taken earlier in the day before the responders got there. But it was clear that something had gone very, very wrong. BP, like every other company that operates in the Gulf of Mexico, is required to have an incident management team in place and an incident management plan. And we did. The role in this organization, which is shared by the Coast Guard and the companies, it's a standard template for how to manage a response. The role that I had trained and drilled for was planning section chief. And the incident management team was called to our offices in BP in Houston very early in the morning of Wednesday, April 21st, when we realized there was a problem, a big issue. I was not on call at the time, so I didn't get a call at that moment. But then later in the day, on Wednesday, we got a call from the Minerals Management Service. The Minerals Management Service was the government entity that regulated all aspects of the offshore oil and gas industry, including leasing, safety, issuing drilling permits, and collecting revenue. The MMS called to inform us that BP Unified Area Command, so that the heart and the command center for this accident had to be run out of New Orleans. And we could not run it out of the place where we fully expected to run it, which was Houston. And that's because the MMS was based in New Orleans. This was a huge shock to us. And they'd never told us that they were going to do this before in the case of a major accident. In addition to that, it was Jazz Fest in New Orleans. There was not a single hotel room or conference facility that we needed, which could house hundreds and hundreds of people in New Orleans. So as we scrambled to figure out how to deal with this new development of our Unified Area Command location, the rig continued to burn. And at 10:22 a.m. on Thursday, April 22nd, it sank. Later that night, on Thursday at about 11 o'clock, I got a call on my cell phone from Peter Zwart, and he asked me if I could report to Unified Area Command in Robert, Louisiana the next morning on Friday. Turned out that our VP of Operations, Cindy Skelton, had a friend who worked for Shell and knew that Shell had just commissioned a brand new emergency response and training center in Robert, Louisiana. And she made one phone call over there and Shell let us in. And we were already starting to staff up there on Thursday. On Friday, April 23rd, the search for survivors was called off. 11 crew members lost their lives. Miraculously, 115 survived. Of those 115, 17 were injured. These are photographs of the crew at a memorial service held by Transocean. Most of the crew worked for Transocean. So these survivors, most of them escaped on the lifeboats that I showed you and some on life rafts, but some of them actually had to jump into the ocean. Now, we take a multi-day offshore survival class every few years, and they teach us how to jump off of a rig. And basically, you're fully clothed with a life preserver on. You hold your nose, and you go like this, and then you jump. And the jump in this case was 100 feet or so. In the middle of the night with flames everywhere. Talk about terrifying. But those people survived. So this is Robert. Robert, Louisiana is basically in the middle of nowhere. It's a crossroads. This is where I flew into on Friday to the tiny Hammond Airport in a plane that was chartered by BP to transfer people basically from Houston to Robert and back and forth. And it is a completely enclosed compound, and it's completely self-sufficient with office buildings, a hotel, and a mess hall, and other outbuildings. And it's enclosed in a chain link fence. And this is where we ran the response for the first month. It's about an hour or so drive north of New Orleans. So the people that were here were BP's incident commander, Doug Suttles, the Coast Guard Federal On-Scene Coordinator, Rear Admiral Mary Landry, the MMS, the Minerals Management Service Regional Director, Lars Herbst, and a Louisiana government representative and a Transocean senior manager. And that was the leadership team for this, for the headquarters of the response, where I was planning section chief, one of the planning section chiefs. And the incident, at this point even, the incident and the response to it were growing so fast, it was incredible. And hundreds of people started pouring into this tiny facility to the point that we had, everybody was coming. Not just BP and the Coast Guard, but the press, NOAA, EPA, Fish and Wildlife, the Army, the Air Force, the Marines, everybody, the Navy, everybody was coming to this headquarters. And soon we ran out of space and we had to install temporary offices in the parking lot. And then the Coast Guard even brought in this huge tractor trailer truck with a conference room inside of it. Meanwhile, the oil was starting to reach the surface of the ocean and spread out due to wind and waves and currents. And at first we were able to monitor the size of the spill with a fixed wing aircraft, and then two. And then it got so big that those two it was moving around too, that I had to order in a couple F-8 jets from Canada with remote sensing capability to monitor the surface of the spill. And so this is probably a good time to talk about why this was so stressful and challenging for me. At this point, when this accident happened, I had been working for BP for more than 20 years, and most of that time in the Deepwater Gulf of Mexico, building that business to the point that we were arguably the #1 owner of resources in the Gulf of Mexico. And just prior to becoming New Wales delivery manager, my previous job was exploration manager for the Gulf of Mexico shelf. In that role, I was on the management team that bought the Macondo leases in the lease sale. I'd also been out to the Deepwater Horizon rig a few months before that when it was on a different prospect on a leadership safety visit. So I felt a lot of ownership in our business in the Gulf of Mexico, and so this accident was really very personal and traumatic for me, as well as for obviously a lot of other people. So when I arrived in Robert, which was on that Friday night, the pressure from the media and the politicians was really intense, and was especially intense on the Coast Guard. And that political pressure, and they really effectively transmitted it to the rest of us. So here I was, planning section chief, with dozens of people reporting to me, most of them Coast Guard, none of whom I knew, and they really did not understand what was going on. They're phenomenal. It was a great experience working with the Coast Guard, but they really deal with the sea surface and above, and they really don't understand anything about how to construct a well or what was actually happening under the sea surface. And I happened to be accessible and one of the only people that did. And so, as the questions started pouring in, I mean, even from Obama, the Obama administration would send questions to Unified Area Command, and we would spend all night coming up with diagrams and explanations for what was actually happening under the surface, and diagrams and so forth. And this is a picture. We didn't take many pictures. We weren't allowed to take pictures, but my uncle somehow found this on the internet. So there you go. So this is me as planning section chief facilitating a meeting at Unified Area Command. This is when we had moved to New Orleans, but there you go. So next, I'm going to summarize what technically went wrong, but before I do that, I need to explain how we drill a well, how to construct a deepwater well. So this on the right here is going to be a blow up of what's depicted schematically over here. So the first thing we do is we start with a 36-inch, what's called a conductor, which is a big 36-inch pipe, hundreds of feet, a couple hundred feet long. And we basically shove it into the mud on the seabed and wash it in there with seawater on drill pipe. It's kind of like shoving using a garden hose, to sink a pipe or something. And it's very soft mud, so that goes pretty quickly. And then what we do is we run cement, and we run cement down the drill pipe. So this is this piece here is like a plunger, right? And so the cement is pink, and it goes down the drill pipe, fills up the bottom of the hole, and then goes around the outside and cements the interval between the rock and the outside, between the rock and the outside of the drill pipe, of the conductor. And that creates a seal. And then we bring that out and go in with a drill bit, and then we drill the next hole section with a slightly smaller bit. So now this is the first piece of pipe in the ground. Now we drill down we've got some fresh rock exposed here. Pull out the drill bit, do the cementing job again. So run cement down the drill pipe, out the bottom, around the outside of that next 28-inch casing. And this is all done with basically seawater, right? So the next thing, now we've gotten to the overpressure section. And so what we do is we pull out that cement stinger and we run the blowout preventer. We're going to talk a lot more about this, but this is basically an enormous valve system with, in this case, 6 valves to control the well. It's the last line of defense for hydrocarbons coming up into the rig in this case. And once we run the blowout preventer, we can then run the riser. And the riser is a pipe that goes around the outside of the drilling string, around the drilling pipe, that isolates the drill pipe from the seawater. So now we have a closed system from the rig down to the bottom of the ocean. And once we do that, we can displace the seawater that's in there with drilling mud. And the drilling mud is a really complicated and engineered fluid, basically, that does a number of things. It turns the bit, and I'll explain that in a minute. It cools the bit, and it brings cuttings from of rock back up to the rig so that you can keep drilling. Those are the primary functions. So now what I want to show you, because this is really important for the later part of this story about what went wrong, I'm going to show you how mud is circulated from the rig down the drill pipe and then up the space between the drill pipe and the casing, between the drill pipe and the BOP, which is this set of valves, and then between the drill pipe and the riser. All right, so let me just do that again because it's kind of important. So it's going down the drill pipe and then up and around and back up to the rig. So it's a circulation path, okay? All right, so now basically we've got the mud system in place, and basically we drill subsequent hole sections all the way down till we get to the final depth, which is called total depth. Down to here. In the case of Macondo, there were 9 different casing sections, so it's telescoping down 9 times. So what went wrong? 3 of the 6 failures, basic reasons that this happened, occurred at the bottom of the well. So we're gonna, let's talk about what was down there. So this is the reservoir shown schematically in yellow, and so that's where the oil was. This was the primary target. There were some secondary targets, but this was the primary target, this thicker yellow interval. So that's what was housing the oil. So if we look at a blow-up of that, here's the reservoir, and then we have the last string of casing was run. The well was at TD, so this was 7-inch casing. The cement, the final cement job had been run, and so you can see there's pink all around here. There was mud in the hole, and the drill pipe was down near the bottom of the well. In addition to that, there were 2 flapper valves, one-way flapper valves, that were designed to not let hydrocarbons back up backwards. So everything's designed to keep those hydrocarbons in the formation until we perforate that later on and then produce it. Okay, so that was the situation, and this is what happened. The first thing that happened, well, I should mention that, so, I mean, this well was basically finished, right? This rig could not do the completion to make it into a producer, so it had to be temporarily abandoned. The well had to be temporarily abandoned. So in order to do that safely, it had to be tested to make sure it was not going to flow without accidentally. And so what we did, you do a positive pressure test. So you basically weight up the mud and you press down on all this equipment down here to see if it will hold extra positive pressure. And it passed that test fine. Then the next thing you do is a much more dangerous test. And you lighten up the system. You displace some of that mud, heavy mud, with lighter seawater till you get to about the place where you think you're matching the reservoir pressure, and that's called a negative pressure test. And that's to test to make sure that the cement has sealed, that the flapper valves are in place, and that there's no hydrocarbons coming up into this casing and drill pipe. There was a lot going on at the time of that negative pressure test. It was actually done twice because there was some confusion about whether it was accurate or not. And there were a lot of simultaneous operations going on in the rig. But basically the issue was that both BP and Transocean eventually accepted that negative pressure test when they should not have. The next thing that went wrong was that the Halliburton cement job did not set up. So this did not form a seal between the cement did not form a seal as it was supposed to between the reservoir and the bottom of the casing here. The third thing that went wrong was that these redundant flapper valves, did not seal, and hydrocarbons were able to move from the reservoir through the cement job, through the two flapper valves, and up into the drill string and the casing. The fourth thing that went wrong, so now we're looking at the BOP system here on the seabed. The fourth thing that went wrong was that this BOP was a series of 6 rams. 6 because there actually were 3 functions, but they're redundancy. 4 of the rams, so 2 of the sets of rams, were designed to go around, to seal around the drill pipe. So remember, the flow is down the drill pipe up the annulus. So they were designed to seal around the drill pipe so that any flow coming up from the annulus was shut off. Remember that flow diagram? So they're doing this so that now they can pressure down on the mud, but no mud should be coming up around the outside. Well, that didn't work because the flow was actually coming right up the drill pipe. And it was not only oil and gas, but it was sand and mud, all of that coming out. And sand going at very high velocity is very erosive. And so it was actually starting to erode the drill pipe and all of the, even inside the BOP, some of those valves. Now there's one other set of valves, and we'll talk about this in more detail, but they're called blind shear rams. And what the blind shear rams do is they actually pinch and then shear that drill pipe right in half and then seal the well. That's what they're designed to do. And there was a redundant set of those in place as well. Those were activated first from the bridge when they initiated the emergency shutdown procedure. They were also activated later on when the rig lost power. And they were also activated after that when we went down with ROVs to try and activate them. I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but I don't remember the order. So basically, the reason this BOP failed to operate as designed is that inside, it was Cameron was the company that manufactures BOPs, and it was an engineering failure because when we recovered that BOP later, several months later, it turned out that we think that the reason it failed to shear the drill pipe is because the drill pipe got bowed inside the BOP, so inside those shear rams, so it was off center. It had been designed to shear it when it was perfectly centered, and so it crimped it, it closed, but it couldn't stop it, and so the flow would not be stopped and didn't get sealed. The next thing that happened is that hydrocarbons actually rose above the BOP into the riser, both the riser and inside the drill string, undetected. There are various ways to detect that with the various measurements that are taken on the rig, but they missed that, basically. And so gas and oil and sand started going up the riser. Remember, this is 5,000 feet from the bottom here up to the rig. In that 5,000 feet, what happens is the pressure starts to get relieved because it's very high pressure at the reservoir, and then the pressure decreases as it comes up. And as that happens, the gas that's trained in the oil comes out of solution, and it rises much faster than the oil. So the first thing that actually came to the rig was gas. and this is all very, very fast though, and I will read you a piece here, but the last thing, the sixth major thing that happened was that the rig crew, on the drill floor, routed that gas into the rig, into the mud gas separator, which is a fairly small system. Their option was to route it into two big 14-inch diverter pipes that would have diverted that material overboard and out of the rig. And that may have gained them precious seconds to actually evacuate, but they didn't do that. And some of the findings from some of these reports indicate that they did not actually have sufficient training to understand what to do in the case of a really a big disastrous situation like this, and that may be why they didn't do that. They just didn't know. So what happened was the gas they funneled the gas into the rig, the gas went all over, went into the engine room and started overspeeding the engines, which then shut down. The rig lost power. The rig, including the ability to stay on location because the thrusters were driven by the engines. And so it started to drift. And then the gas found sources of ignition, and then we had the explosion and the fire. As the rig started to drift away, it disconnected from the drill pipe and the riser, moved away, and then eventually sank. So gas was allowed to go right up to the rig. And I want to read you a very short piece of what it was like to be on the rig from one of the survivors. Sometime between 9:40 and 9:43 p.m., drilling mud began spewing from the rotary onto the rig floor. This appears to have been the first moment Rivette or others realized that a kick had occurred. At about that time, Anderson and assistant driller Stephen Curtis returned to the rig floor. The men took immediate action. First, they routed the flow coming from the riser through the diverter system, deciding to send it into the mud gas separator rather than overboard into the sea, which was another option. Second, they closed one of the annular preventers on the BOP to shut in the well. At roughly 9:45 p.m., assistant driller Curtis called a senior tool pusher, Azell, to tell him that the well was blowing out, that mud was going into the crown on top of the derrick, and that Anderson was shutting the well in. Their efforts were futile. By the time the rig crew acted, gas was already above the BOP, rocketing up the riser and expanding rapidly. At the Commission's November 8, 2010 hearing, a representative from Transocean likened it to a 550-ton freight train hitting the rig floor, followed by what he described as a jet engine's worth of gas coming out of the rotary. The flow from the well quickly overwhelmed the mud gas separator system. Ignition and explosion were all but inevitable. The first explosion occurred at approximately 9:49 p.m. On the drilling floor, the Macondo disaster claimed its first victims. So that's what it was like. And we talked about that. So just to emphasize this, so this is a schematic from Transocean of the Horizon BOP. So what the first thing that happened was the crew closed these upper annulars, which was basically too late because the oil was already there and sand and eroding those seals. Secondly, they closed the variable bore rams, which again close around the drill pipe. The shear rams closed from the rig floor also when the rig lost power, and were also tried to be closed by ROV, but all of that was ineffective because they simply weren't doing what they were designed to do. And this is a massive piece of equipment, 6 stories tall, 300 tons, capable of holding back 15,000 psi of pressure. So this is a massive, massive piece of equipment. 6 stories tall. Here's a few quick animation of what the blind shear rams are supposed to do. Cut it and seal it. So just to recap then, what went wrong? The first thing was that BP and Transocean accepted that negative pressure test. Secondly, the Halliburton cement did not set up as designed. Third, the Weatherford flapper valves didn't seal. Fourth, the Cameron BOV failed to seal the well. In particular, the blind shear rams failed to seal. Fifth, BP and Transocean didn't realize hydrocarbons had entered the riser, in other words, had moved up above the BOP. And then finally, and tragically, the Transocean crew routed gas into the rig instead of diverting it overboard. So, meanwhile, as per our, well, this was the situation on the seabed. So the rig had sunk, and fortunately was pretty far away from the wellhead. The riser with the drill pipe inside it were crumpled on the seabed, and they were leaking from 3 places. This here was the worst of the 3 leaks. Meanwhile, as per our incident response plan, we had brought in 2 rigs. We stopped what they were doing in another field and brought in 2 rigs to drill relief wells. And the idea of a relief well is that you actually drill down and intersect this wellbore. In this case, it was at, I don't know, about 17,500 feet. And the reason you had to drill it down that deeply was because this drill bit could only drill through 1 string of casing. And you remember all those telescoping casings? So there were, above that, there were at least 2 in every other place. So we had to drill down almost to the top of the reservoir to intercept the well. On the surface now, we had mitigation plans that we were executing. This is called fire boom, and this boom is drugged by 2 ships to collect the oil so it's thick enough to be actually combusted on the surface. We also had skimming operations going on, done by this giant Coast Guard oil spill response vessels, but also by little fishing boats who were hired because they were out of work, they couldn't fish, and so we hired them as in our Vessels of Opportunity program. We had thousands and thousands of them. Dispersants were probably our most effective tool. So these are chemical dispersants that we injected at the wellhead. Here down, so this is a picture of an ROV with a wand injecting dispersants into the flowing oil, and then also by air using airplanes. What the dispersants do is they break up the oil into, it's like soap, break it up into really tiny little droplets so that it can be eaten by microorganisms that occur naturally. They're naturally in the Gulf of Mexico. For the oil that did reach the beach, we hired armies, and I mean armies of people to clean the beaches. A lot of these people had been previously unemployed, or some of them were recently out of prison, and we were paying very, very well. And even when the beaches were absolutely spotless, it was very difficult to stand down these teams because we were the employer of choice on the Gulf Coast. The first, so back in Houston, we had teams of people that were trying to figure out how to stop the leaks or mitigate the leaks, and we had all of these companies sent us, every major oil company and service company sent us their best engineers to help us. In fact, I will read you another very short paragraph here. Within a week of the explosion, BP embarked on what would become a massive effort to generate containment options, either by adapting shallow water technology to the deep water environment or by designing entirely new devices. Different teams at BP's Houston headquarters focused on different ways to either stop the flow of oil or to collect it at the source. Each team had what amounted to a blank check. As one contractor put it, whatever you needed, you got it. If you needed something from a machine shop and you couldn't jump in line, you bought the machine shop. So the first thing we put down there was called the coffer dome, and that didn't work. It got plugged up with gas hydrates. Fortunately, the next thing we tried did work, and we called it the top hat. And basically it went down and it sat over the top of this particular leak, the worst one, and it captured the oil and routed it up to the surface. So it routed it to two vessels, the Enterprise and the Q4000. Those vessels stored the oil on board. They had storage compartments, and then they flared the gas. And there was quite a lot of gas. And these are the flares coming off of the Enterprise and the Q4000. And they were so hot that they had to be cooled by these support vessels with seawater. So that's a support vessel spraying that flame to keep it from melting the flare. So at this time, the response was growing exponentially. And for the first time in Coast Guard history, we had to go down to a tier that they'd never done before, which was called the branch level. And so BP sourced our best operations managers from around the world for the first 8 branches. And they all arrived, at the time I was in Homa, they all arrived in Homa, and I gave them their orientation. I gave them an orientation of what had happened in the accident up to that point, and then arranged an overflight for them. And so we went up in a helicopter and we followed the coastline and then flew out to the site of the accident. And it's important to note that until we got to basically this location here and saw this scene, that was the first time we saw any oil. And this was probably a month and a half, 2 months into the accident. So this was a massive, massive effort. We had 5 response posts in 5 different states, or 4 different states, source control in Houston. Our operations were run out of Homa, and then we had other smaller organizations in Miami and Galveston just in case the oil got there, which it never really did. We had 20 branch offices set up ultimately in 5 states. At the height of the response, we had 48,000 responders checking into our personnel system on a daily basis. That was half the size of BP globally at the time, more than half the size. It was really an unprecedented response. We had hired 6,500 vessels, 125 airplanes, including the US Navy blimp. And we had 6 rigs in the vicinity helping with the response. But not only were there 6 rigs, there were 19 major vessels. So that's not including the vessels that are coming to resupply you with people and food and all that stuff for all these people. Those were 19 major vessels. So I'm guessing something on the order of each more than 150 feet long. And we had 16 ROVs, the remote operated vehicles, the little underwater robots, operating in this and that. And this is all in just a couple, at most 2 mile area, 2 miles. So this had never, ever, ever been done before. But we did it all that simultaneous operations. There was not a single collision. And the largest deployment near shore of a collection boom, ever in the world. 13.5 million feet of it. But the top hat was only temporary. We had to permanently cap the well. And we did this 87 days later when the flow of oil was choked off on July 15th, 2010. And the US government estimated the total discharge of oil during those 87 days to be 4.9 million barrels. This is a look at that ceiling cap that was installed. Again, you can see the scale of it from these people here. So all that equipment that was already on the seabed, the old BOP had to be removed, and this had to be flanged on. The cost of BP kept going up. The first time I gave this talk, it was $60 billion. Now it's $65 billion as of January of last year, and I think that's probably the end of it. But not only was BP impacted, of course, the people of the Gulf Coast were impacted financially, mentally, possibly physically. So BP set up a health fund to monitor them and help them. Wildlife were impacted. Thousands of animals were impacted. Some of them died, but many of them were actually rehabilitated. The environmental impact of the spill is still being assessed and studied, and it will be for many, many years. Fishermen were impacted. They were put out of work by the fishing ban. Many of them were hired, most of them probably were hired back by BP in that Vessels of Opportunity program. Tourism was impacted. And fish, there was a ban on Gulf Coast fishing, but the next year it actually bounced back very, very well, and tourism was impacted. But BP funded all these ads to sponsor tourism and also the fishing industry. And so by the next year, everything had really bounced back. The oil industry was impacted because the rigs 33 rigs in the Gulf of Mexico were shut down by the moratorium, by the government. And when you can't drill new wells, your production in existing fields starts to decline because you can't replace that well stock. So that was a big hit to the industry. The Minerals Management Service was also not immune. They were restructured into 3 groups. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, these guys are responsible for the lease sales, safety and environment. This group also does the drilling permits, and then this group collects the revenue from royalties and lease sales. BP did a lot of things to mitigate this spill that none of them made primetime news. I'll give you one example. In the spring, sea turtles lay their eggs on the sandy beaches of Florida, and then the turtles hatch and they go out to the Gulf of Mexico and they swim and float along with the current, and they float around to the to the Atlantic side of Florida. And so we didn't want these turtles to be swimming in any possible oily water, and so BP hired thermal and vibration controlled trucks and transported tens of thousands of turtle eggs from the Gulf Coast to the Atlantic coast and put them in holes. Politics. So I was so naive when I was in this spill. I had never dealt with politicians, and I had never dealt with the media. So when I was in Unified Area Command, I was in the coffee bar, and our lawyer, Bill Colbert, came in, and very mild-mannered guy, super nice guy, steam's coming out of his ears. I'm like, Bill, what is going on? He said, well, we just gave the state of Louisiana, in a gesture of goodwill, $40 million. Just because, it's been a couple months, and we know they're incurring all these fees, like overtime for policemen and all this other stuff. So we gave them $40 million. And he said, you know what we got back? We got back a letter from Bobby Jindal. I said, we're going to thank you very much, and we're going to use 20 million of that to sue you. Oil boom. At first, all the oil was headed toward Louisiana, and so we started sending boom to Louisiana, and then with the wind and the waves and things, it started shifting, and it started shifting over to Mississippi and Alabama. So we tried to take boom on trucks and move it from Louisiana to Mississippi, and we got stopped at the border. Bobby Jindal had sent the state troopers there to stop the boom from leaving his state, because by then, boom had become like a proxy for how much pressure each of the governors were putting on BP, and the more boom you had, the more pressure you were putting on BP. So he did not want it leaving the state. The result of that was we had to move all of our staging areas to the next tier of states north so that we could move them where the supplies need to be. That was very inefficient and very costly. The media. BP set up claims offices all along the Gulf Coast to repay people for loss of earnings that they were experiencing because of the spill. What we didn't realize was the magnitude of the cash economy in the Gulf Coast. And so in each one of these claims offices, there was a BP representative and an IRS agent sitting right next to them. And if the person that came in did not have a tax record to prove what they earned the previous year so that we could pay them, reimburse them for this year, we could not pay them anything. And so these people were in tears. And so they come out of the claims office, and who's right there waiting for them but the media? And what did the media say? BP is not paying these people because of paperwork. Yeah, paperwork is called a tax return, you know. Obama gets into the act now, and he starts vilifying BP. So at this point, our senior executives had to arrange a meeting with Obama, and they went and met with him, and they said, listen, we are days away from bankruptcy. If you keep up this rhetoric, we're going to go bankrupt, and the entire cost of the spill is going to fall on US taxpayers. We don't want that. You don't want that. But here's what we'll do is we will promise $20 billion in settlement if you stop vilifying BP, which he did, and it was sort of just in time. And we remained solvent. So I was in Robert, Louisiana, walking between buildings, and this is Doug Suttles. He was our incident commander there, and he's shaking his head. He's like, Cynthia, you're not going to believe who just called me. I'm like, no, I won't. He's like, Kevin Costner. I'm like, he said, Kevin Costner, after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, Kevin Costner invested in centrifuges. And he wants to sell us some. And so we're like, okay. But we actually bought some. And so the reason that they're big, huge centrifuges, but by the time we got them working, it was too late. There was no more oil to skim. But the reason they're important is that when you're offshore, when you're 50 miles offshore in a very slow boat, and you start skimming all this oil, most of what you get is water. So it's 90+% water with a little bit of oil. So if you can centrifuge it to the point where you can concentrate the oil, it means you need to take fewer trips back, like a lot fewer trips back to port to get rid of that oil. So that's why they're valuable. They are part of our marine response equipment now. Obviously, BP's CEO, Tony Hayward, stepped down, and he was replaced by Bob Dudley. This was a massive hit to BP's image. Me and a lot of other people stopped wearing our BP logo clothing. Fear for personal safety, even in Houston. And also embarrassment. I mean, I was really deeply disturbed and embarrassed that we had been a party to such a tremendous and horrible accident. So what changed, you might ask? Well, sort of everything. We reorganized the structural organization to single centralized wells organization. We locked all our best drilling engineers in rooms and had them rewrite every single procedure for drilling wells. We installed a 24/7, 365 days a year monitoring center in Houston. So this is an entire floor of our building in Houston where all the critical sensors from the rigs and cameras were mounted on the rigs, and they were displayed here and monitored as a sort of monitored separately from the people that were monitoring on the rig. We created a simulator which we used to train offshore personnel, and again, remember I said that some of those rig crew were not necessarily trained in diverting the hydrocarbons overboard, so we created one and we trained other people's crews, I mean like Transocean crews that were working on our wells, and many other things. So by I forgot to mention that I was also leading the team that went to the BSEE, the new branch of government that granted drilling permits, to get permission, convince them technically to to allow us to drill our first well after Macondo. Most people didn't think, or the Deepwater Horizon, most people didn't think, even within BP, that we'd ever be allowed to drill again in the Deepwater Gulf of Mexico. But we did, and we got that first drilling permit. And from there, we ramped our drilling fleet up to 10 rigs operating in the Gulf of Mexico by 2014. That was the most rigs we'd ever had in the Gulf of Mexico. While we had the moratorium and couldn't drill, and as we were ramping those up, our oil production fell by 50%. By the time we got to 2014, we had recovered all of that production, and we were back up to full capacity. So in recognition of that, and all of the hard work done by all the teams in the Gulf of Mexico, we won in 2014 BP's top corporate award, and it was a Helios award. It was presented by Bob Dudley, our CEO here, in a ceremony in London. And I was honored to be able to accept the award on behalf of the Gulf of Mexico teams. Thank you.